Hello, welcome to Retrieving Reason Podcast, Episode 13. Reason is Ontological. I'm Dr. Kelly Fitzsimmons Burton, and we've been going over a series on reason is an aspect of human nature, or reason in us, reasoning. So today we're going to talk about how reasoning is reasoning about being. So reason is ontological means that reason applies to being as well as to our thinking. Now, I wrote my book 2 years ago, Retrieving Reason, a Socratic Response to Skepticism, on this topic. It's something I'm fascinated with, and the history of philosophy begins with the dual concepts of logos, or reason, and ontos, being. And these two concepts are emphasized by some philosophers and some are emphasized by others. So in the early history of philosophy, the philosophers were, I claim, searching for the relationship between reason and being, between logos and ontos. This is something I developed in Retrieving Reason from the first philosophers to Socrates, and then I skipped over a big chunk of history and picked up with Nietzsche in the 1850s-ish. So one of the purposes of this podcast is for me to help myself develop the ideas that I left out between Socrates and Nietzsche in terms of the relationship between reason and being and how that changes and develops differently over time. But let's talk about the first philosophers. These philosophers were material monists. They thought all that exists is matter. And they were empiricists in their epistemology. They thought all of our knowledge is through the senses. And these two ideas developed together led ultimately to skepticism. I will talk about two philosophers. First, Heraclitus, who was a materialist and an empiricist. He was maybe one of the first philosophers that talked in depth about the logos. He said the logos is all around us, but men fail to see it. And he lamented this. He thought that the logos was, he thought that the logos was something like order in the world. These first philosophers saw that there was the logos in our mind. Rationality is the logos in us. So this is how reason is an aspect of our nature, like we talked about last time. But the logos is also in the world. And the logos is in the world in terms of the laws of nature, natural law, and the moral order of the world. The question is, how do we explain that? How do we ground the logos in ultimate reality? Because it has to have an origin. What is its origin? And if you start with matter, it leads to some questions down the road. So if everything that exists is matter, as Heraclitus thought, and it's in motion, then there is nothing that's permanent. There's no permanent being in the natural world, and there's no permanent aspect to human nature. Everything is flux. And so how do we ground the logos in being if being is not permanent? That was a problem that led to skepticism for some of the first philosophers who went with the flux doctrine. We really can't know. And Parmenides is another philosopher who emphasized ontos, being. He believed that all is being and all is one. There's no non-being. Now, if you think about it, it kind of makes sense to say there's no non-being. But when you say all is being and all is material being, he thought all is one thing, so motion and change is not possible. And that led to another kind of skepticism. So everything we experience is untrue. it's a fiction. It's an illusion. And so the first philosophers bottomed out in skepticism. And this could have been the end of philosophy, but Socrates questioned the assumptions of materialism and empiricism in his dialogue Theaetetus. This is what I write about in my book. And he develops the logos, and he talks about how knowledge is a true account, a true belief with an account. And an account is the logos. It's reasons, and reasons ties down your true belief. Now, I got to this point in my thinking by following how the philosophers are talking about the logos. And Socrates proposes that there is something that's permanent. In ourself, it's the soul. And in the world, it's the realm of the ideas. And the ideas are problematic because he seems to be saying thoughts are beings. And that's got a whole another set of issues. We could talk about that elsewhere. But he makes he collapses the distinction between thinking and being in another way. So ideas are beings. Aristotle didn't like this. And Aristotle begins his Metaphysics, which is a book about being. I should say being is what exists, what is. And Socrates, in his definitions, is always trying to get at what is. That's why he asks, what is justice? What is knowledge? So what is? And notice those aren't physical things. Justice is not a physical thing. Knowledge is not a physical thing. The good is not a physical thing, but he's wanting to get to those. So being is what is, but being has aspects, properties, states, different qualities. And sometimes beings can be thought by beings, like imaginary beings. So I can think about a unicorn even though they don't exist. They have properties. This unicorn is white and has a horn, and it's beautiful with a beautiful flowing mane. I could describe it to you, but it doesn't exist apart from me thinking about it. So it's an imaginary being. So we can qualify being, but being has properties. It has it exists. It has properties. It has the power to continue to be. I guess some beings die, but if it dies, then is it still being? Okay, I don't want to go into metaphysics, but Aristotle begins his book, The Metaphysics, talking about being. But he also develops the laws of thought in relation to being. So he brings in the laws of thought, not in the logic, but in the metaphysics. And in the metaphysics, he says that explicitly. Being, reason is grasping being. When we grasp concepts, concepts are grasping the essential nature of a being, or the non-essential qualities as well. So concepts grasp the nature of the thing. So things have a nature. He also says that words express meaning, and meaning is what bees. So if our words are meaningful, it's because they express what is. And he makes, in chapter 4, book 4 of the Metaphysics, he makes it very, very clear that if you were to divorce reason from being, our words become meaningless. It's a kind of nihilism, meaninglessness. So I'm emphasizing this because I think it's very, very important to recognize that to divorce reason from being is going to lead to meaninglessness, and is going to cause the breakdown in our communication. Now, in my book, I go from Aristotle to Nietzsche. He dies in 1900, but he wanted to overthrow all of the philosophy before him, particularly Platonism and Christianity. And it's because both Platonism and Christianity, emphasizes this need to connect reason and being. Nietzsche thought that reason, the laws of thought, are invented by philosophers. And he thinks it's understandable, we need the laws of thought, but we do it to impose order on the world. It's not that we're grasping what's in the world, we're imposing order on the world, and we have to do this because all is flux. Nietzsche agrees with, maybe even takes it a step further, the flux doctrine of Heraclitus. He's also a radical empiricist, and he's also going to lead to radical skepticism and nihilism. He recognizes this. He's not super happy with nihilism. He says what we need to do is throw off all of that old philosophy of the past, and we need to make new values, basically. He calls this the revaluation of values. And this is us imposing our power and order on the world. We're not playing this game anymore where we, invent philosophies in order to maintain some kind of coherent worldview and order. He doesn't want to go that way. But he is doing the same thing, basically. He's saying, forget all that old stuff, let's invent something new. And he's using reason to do it, even in his claim to divorce reason from being. So he is going to say, reason does not apply to being. We cannot know being. Now, why is this significant? Analytic philosophy in England and the United States doesn't really take Nietzsche that seriously. They don't see him as a philosopher. They see him as some kind of a poet, maybe. I don't know, a guy for literature. But they were reading Nietzsche in their spare time. And I try to connect the analytic school of philosophy to the same ideas of materialism and empiricism and the divorce of reason from being. Analytic philosophy explicitly rejects metaphysics and ethics based on the good. The same ideas that Nietzsche is rejecting, even though they don't take Nietzsche seriously. I think it has to do with the assumptions that they have. Materialism, empiricism is going to lead to the same nihilism. They develop logic, the logical positivists, but logic doesn't describe reality in any way. So they divorce logic from being. The continental philosophers, particularly Heidegger and then Foucault and Derrida, are going to take Nietzsche more seriously and claim to be continuing his project. And the continuation of the project is to deconstruct and revalue the values. And you can see that happening today. Anything that's Christian or Platonic or, related to those is undergoing a deconstruction. And it's because we've first divorced reason from being. We really can't know. And they haven't really defended their positions well. So I argue in my book that those philosophers that claim reason does not apply to being, contemporary philosophers, are post-Nietzschean philosophers. And post-Nietzschean philosophy will always lead to skepticism and nihilism, meaninglessness. Because words don't express being, words express, they're conventional. And concepts don't grasp the essential nature of a thing because we can't know the thing. So words are conventional merely, and we can change the meaning of words if we want to. And guess who gets to change the meaning of words? Those who are in power. So knowledge is a power play. Knowledge isn't about reality. It's not like we're trying to know what is anymore. We're trying to define things as we want and see if we can get away with it and see if we can get the majority to agree with us. And what the majority agrees with becomes true. If you don't believe me, look around. Words are being changed. They're being emptied of their original meaning. Almost the opposite is happening sometimes. Things don't have a nature, so the words don't express any being, and the words are malleable and changeable. Okay, so why would we think that? Why should we go that way? Here's why. Because those who are dominant in the academy have said so. They haven't provided any reasons. I would like to see a reason I should believe that matter is all that exists. And I would like to see some reasons why I should assume that all of my knowledge is through my senses. I can't know anything through my senses. Nietzsche saw that. We can't know anything through our senses if everything is changing. There's nothing there permanently fixed to know. So why should I go that way? I'm going to say we shouldn't go that way. I'm going to affirm A is A, and A is A means pencil is pencil. Human is human. Matter is matter. And these things do have a nature, could be understood, and we can see that reason applies to being has implications like this. There are no square circles. A square is a plane geometric figure with 4 right angles, and a circle is a plane geometric figure with all points on the radius equidistant from the center. They are not equivalent. They're not identical. A is not non-A. So reason tells us that. No square circles. Reason also tells us there are no uncaused events. Events are things that are caused. There are no uncaused caused things. It doesn't make any sense. It's meaningless. There's no being from non-being. Reason tells us that. So let's think about that. I just said being exists. It has powers. It has properties. Non-being doesn't exist. It has no power, has no properties. You cannot get being from something that does not exist. It makes no sense. And if you try to do that, then you're reifying non-being, which means you're making non-being into a being. So being comes from being. Okay. Reason is ontological, and when we divorce reason from being, we end up saying meaningless things. We end up with skepticism, radical skepticism. And Nietzsche tried to live his philosophy. Now, some people say he died, he was insane. He died of the effects of syphilis. But others say, no, that's not the case. If you look at his diaries and what he was writing, he was practicing his philosophy. And there's a point where he says, today I crossed the Rubicon, which means I'm going to the point of no return in his thinking. And the next day he snapped, and his friends had to come collect him, and he was never the same. He never produced another work. And the rest of his life was silent. So when you give up reason, you move to silence. And that's what happened to him. Now, one other thing I talk about in my book is John the Apostle and the prologue to his gospel in the New Testament. In the prologue, he talks about the Logos. And it seems like he is specifically answering the early philosophers' search for the Logos. They were looking for an explanation. How can this be? How can this be like there's rationality in me, there's order in the world, and I can understand the world? Why is that? John the Apostle says it's because God put it there. God created it that way. And not only that, but the Logos is God. He was with God and he was God, and he's eternal. So there's an eternal Logos that creates human beings with rationality. The Logos in us creates the world with order so that there's a natural law in the world and there's a moral law within us. And humans do fail to see that. Heraclitus was right. We don't see it. We reject it. We kill the Logos. That's called logicide. And logicide leads to deicide. How do I know? Because the Logos came to his own through the prophets in the written word, the scriptures. And the Logos came incarnate in Christ, the Messiah. And they killed him. The Logos incarnate, they killed him because humans don't want the logos. There's something deep within us where we reject it. So that's the human problem, rejection of the logos. But he comes full of grace and truth, so he's not going to allow humans to go fully into that darkness. The darkness cannot overcome the light. The light shines in the darkness. So there is hope. There is hope for the logos, but there's also a struggle. There's a reality to humans rejecting reason, and it usually comes out in this area, reason and being. Look at the history of philosophy. I hope to develop it here. Look at the history of humans, and why do we always want to kill the person bringing the truth? I don't know. I'll let you think about that. Today we talked about reason is ontological. It is based in our nature, rationality, and in the world, being. It means that there are no square circles. There are no uncaused events, no being from non-being. Reason puts a limit on being. What can be. You may not like that, but that's it. So next time we want to talk about reason is transcendental. How reason is a source of authority and common ground for all human beings. Reason is the authority. It's the highest authority. Ooh, controversial stuff. All right, I'm going to pause here. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. And thank you for listening.